Some of you guys have been Googling very weird stuff. Hey, I'm Joe Carmack, welcome back to Living in Minnesota, and in this video, I wanted to do an updated pros and cons for you, but the interwebs do not need another video to tell you that we've got mosquitoes and we've got snowflakes. So instead, I found this website. They've got the top things that you guys have been asking Google about living in Minnesota, and I'm gonna answer those for you right now. All right, here we go. What celebrities live in Minnesota? We've got Bob Dylan was famous, and Prince are probably our most famous people that have lived in Minnesota. What animals live in Minnesota and what snakes live in Minnesota. Okay, now these kind of people are my kind of people. As far as animals, pretty much anything with a lot of fur that can survive the winters lives here. We really don't have any major snakes. We've got lots of garter snakes and stuff. What YouTubers live in Minnesota? Well, hello, I do.
Do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal.
Spiders live in Minnesota. What owls live in Minnesota? Spiders, I don't know of any big, major, scary, poisonous kinds of ones.
Wait, spiders? Why couldn't it be follow the butterflies?
The owls eat the squirrels, which is fantastic, so we like the owls. They can stick around. What rappers live in Minnesota? Lizzo. Where to live in Minnesota and where to live in MN. I've actually got a whole channel on this, and I don't want to just plug the channel, but I will say if you go to our YouTube channel after this video, we've got a whole playlist with Twin Cities neighborhood tours, so you can go check that out later. Where do otters live? Where do moose live? And where do wolves live? Pretty much all those are up north. Otters would be in the rivers. We do have some moose, as I understand, but they're way up north towards the Canadian border. Where do wolves live? Definitely up north as well. Where do cougars live? That'd be about 2 doors down from my house. Where do possums live? I don't know. Where do possums live? Like in a sewer, I guess. Where do rattlesnakes live? I don't think they really live in Minnesota. I think technically maybe we have rattlesnakes. This isn't like Texas or whatever. Who lives in Minnesota? I don't know, people. Where's the safest place to live in Minnesota? Where not to live in Minneapolis? Most dangerous places to live in Minnesota. Okay, so let's talk about where to live around the state. This is probably a good time to point out that as an agent, I can't tell you which is a good neighborhood or a bad neighborhood, what's safe or not. If you're coming from rural Nebraska, where there's basically zero crime that happens ever, this is going to be a huge shock to you. But if you're coming from other places like LA or New York or some of these that I heard of that are really high crime areas, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Is Minnesota a bad place to live? Is Minnesota a good state to live in? Okay, if we're not talking about neighborhoods specifically, is Minnesota overall a good state? Here's what I'll tell you. If you're miserable where you're at, you're probably gonna be miserable here. You're gonna find happiness within yourself, and hopefully you find that here. If not, whatever. Who lives in Delwood, Minnesota? I don't even know where Delwood is, so who's Googling that? Is Minnetonka, Minnesota a good place to live? Yeah, it is. That's a whole area off to the west side of the Twin Cities. It's a huge lake system, and it's a city, and then a lot of the locals would just call it Minnetonka as a general area, but there's actually 4 or 5 different towns right within it. Where not to live in Minneapolis? That's another one. This is one of those questions I can't answer, but go to the crime websites and you can figure out where you'd feel comfortable living. Who owns Minnesota Life? Is that a thing? I don't know what Minnesota Life is. Who owns the state? I have no idea. Why was Darius living in Minnesota? I don't know, is that Darius Rucker? I don't know who that is.
What if I told you about my little nothing town?
Why is Minnesota the best place to live? Because of all the outdoor stuff that you can do, plus you got all the cities and all the stuff to do. There, it's the best of both worlds. Is Minnesota a bad place to live? Is Minnesota a safe place to live? I don't think it's a bad place. Can we talk about crime and safety again just for a second? Because it's asked so many times on my channel. I think that you gotta realize that with any metro, the closer you are, the higher density of population, the more crime there's gonna be naturally. Do you think it's also worth mentioning with George Floyd and all the things that happened in the past few years? I think that also kind of skews people's mindset about crime, even locals or people that are moving to Minnesota, to make it seem like it's a lot higher crime area than it is. I would just encourage you, just look at the crime stats for other major metros around the country, and I think you're gonna be pleasantly surprised with Minnesota. Can alligators live in Minnesota? Termites live in Minnesota? Can cockroaches live in Minnesota? Alligators, really?
Only the bite was quicker than the eye.
Okay, alligators, I don't think so. I mean, maybe in a zoo, I guess, but I don't even think I've seen those at the zoo. Termites, that's a valid question. I do have people moving from the south asking about termite inspections. We don't do that up here. I think it's just too cold or something. Can cockroaches live in Minnesota? I mean, I guess theoretically, but it's such a cold area that we don't really have a lot of insects necessarily or a lot of major problem with things like cockroaches and termites. Can palm trees live in Minnesota? No, I don't think so. Is living in Minnesota expensive? No, I would say overall our cost of living is kind of average. What is living in Minnesota like? So this is kind of funny. People here are kind of passive aggressive. That is definitely a thing. Minnesota nice.
Oh, fine. I want to work in this department. Every time I'm in here, you're on break. Okay.
Kind of like me, and you might be a little too blunt or a little more forward for people. They can get their toes stepped on and get a little offended more easily. But also, if people got a problem with you, they usually just keep it to themselves because people are all kind of in their little silos, especially with the winter months, right? But on the flip side, lately, especially, we've been a lot more vocal about advocating for different things and protesting and rioting and stuff. So it's kind of an interesting mix of people around here. What are the cons of living in Minnesota? Okay, if you don't like winter, obviously, doesn't it go without saying by now, we have a lot of winters right now. My kids are actually home from school because we're supposed to be getting between 14 and 24 inches of snow. If you're the type that comes to Minnesota and you can't stand cold, people from Texas, for example, the whole city's shutting down because it's like 50 degrees. We don't do that around here, but cold is definitely gonna be the number one thing that I have people having issues with. In the Twin Cities area, it's a lot more liberal here, and then it gets a little more conservative as you go out. So if you just don't like the political situation that you're in, I suppose that could affect it. I would say the number one con for living in Minnesota is going to be our tax situation. Put them all together, we do have a pretty high tax situation for Minnesota. How many billionaires live in Minnesota? How many millionaires live in Minnesota? I have no idea. There's a ton of major corporations, so I imagine we have a decent number of them.
$1 million.
But again, this isn't exactly New York, so average. How many Hmong live in Minnesota? Actually a ton. There's a huge Hmong population in the Twin Cities. Don't quote me, but I think we're the number one in the US Hmong population. How many Ethiopian live in Minnesota? I have no idea. I don't think we have a lot of Ethiopian people specifically, but it is a great diverse area. There's tons of people from all different walks of life. So generally, I think most people feel really comfortable living here no matter where or what background they come from. So there you go. That's your top 70 questions as you've asked from Google. So I hope that helps. If you have more questions or if there's something that we missed, post it in the comments down below and all the locals and I can jump in and answer those for you. And when you're ready, you'll find all my contact info in the description down below.